Hey guys, I'm Jackie, senior tutor with Prepped and Polished, and you're here for a segment of grammar rules that you must know. So if you guys haven't joined us before, just to fill you in, there have been 6 other segments like this one that range toward about an hour, and we cover a variety of grammar topics from punctuation to rules of use and mechanics, as well as some rhetorical things like how to revise and fix your own writing. And we kind of evolved over time, guys. So we started out relatively easy with punctuation and comma rules, and then lately we've been moving into more complex topics like how to revise your own writing. Today we're going to go down a similar alley and look at how to write with a strong writing voice. Okay, so this is something you've probably heard of or talked about at school, but maybe you're not exactly sure what that means, or how do I write in a way, okay, that would be considered strong writing. Okay, so for today's session, guys, we are going to be going over this. We're going to look at active and passive voice, as well as how to develop your writing in a way, okay, that comes off strong, that comes off concise, authoritative. Okay, so we're going to look at all of these things. Okay, so let's get started. All right, guys. So like I mentioned, okay, today our main focus is going to be on developing a strong writing voice, okay? How do you make yourself sound confident, sure, and how do you make your ideas come across in a way, right, that's going to make them sound clear, concise, and strong. That's the key, okay? All right, guys. All right, so we're going to start out just by talking about what a strong writing voice is, okay? All right, sorry about that. Let me just readjust. Okay. Sorry, guys, I forgot if I change the size of my window, it will affect it on your screen as well. Okay, so a strong writing voice, okay? This means primarily your ideas are presented with authority, conviction, and confidence, okay? So this also means your writing doesn't have unnecessary qualifiers or vocabulary. This is something that we talked about last week when we looked at revision and taking out unnecessary wording, okay, or words that take away from the writing, the focus of the writing, okay? They can actually make it more jumbled and more confusing, right? So we talked about word economy last week, which means that if you can say something in fewer words, right, and get the same point across, that's typically the better way to write it, that you would rather have the same ideas come across, okay, in fewer words than more. It'll make your writing easier to understand, okay, and it'll make your points the emphasis of your writing, okay. All right, guys, so we're going to look at 2 examples here, one with a kind of weak writing and then one that's improved that would exemplify strong writing, okay? So I'm going to read aloud this first example, and then we're going to look at how we could tweak it or change it to make it strong. Okay? So this is an example of weak writing. In Harper Lee's famous and well-known book, To Kill a Mockingbird, the author probably writes from the point of view of a child to really display the themes of unfairness and racism. And the town's racist culture seems more prominent due to this perspective. Okay. So as I read that, guys, if it didn't sound totally wrong, it's not. There are no specific grammar errors, okay? So there's nothing, no commas out of place, there are no run-on sentences, the mechanics are correct, okay, but it's still weak, right? And we're going to look at a number of reasons why. So if it didn't sound incorrect to you, it's not, okay? But if it didn't sound strong, right, we're going to look at why, okay? So we'll talk about the specifics of what made the statement weak next, okay? But now we're going to look at an example side by side of strong writing. Okay, guys, so this is basically the same statement, okay, so it says the same information, and I want you to know how much shorter it is, okay, so a lot of revision, editing, and shifting toward weak or confusing writing into strong and clear writing, a lot of it is about taking out unnecessary words. So a lot of your revising, you should be deleting or removing information that doesn't benefit what you're writing and that doesn't move the writing forward. Okay, so let's look at an example now of strong writing. The themes of racism and injustice in Harper Lee's novel To Kill a Mockingbird are emphasized by the innocent, childlike perspective from which the story is told. Okay. So even though this doesn't use more complex vocabulary than the first one, and it says the same ideas, right, this one sounds a lot clearer. It's a lot more to the point, okay, and it emphasizes your main point as opposed to kind of waste time on unnecessary words and phrasing. Okay. All right, guys, so if we're going to look at how to improve your writing and make your writing voice stronger, it's really important that you understand what actually makes writing weak, okay? So what affects your writing in a way that makes it not strong. All right, guys, so we're going to look at that initial statement, okay, the weak version of the, we call it a topic sentence or a thesis statement, okay, and look at the reasons why, what made this weak, okay. All right, so primarily, guys, we're going to look at a couple different things that will do with rhetoric, okay, so not grammar we're fixing. Okay, so first, redundancy. This means something's been unnecessarily repeated, okay. So in the first start of this, the introductory clause, we have in Harper Lee's famous and well-known novel, okay. So we don't need both of those statements, famous and well-known, while different vocabulary, obviously, say the same thing, okay? They don't make unique points about the novel. Okay. All right, wordiness, guys. So this is similar to redundancy, but redundancy specifically means that you've repeated information that's already been stated, okay? Wordiness is qualifiers or adjectives or information, okay, that only takes away from the text because it's unnecessary, okay? So we have a couple of these qualifiers in here, right? Probably there's almost no reason to ever include this in your writing. It's always going to make it sound a little bit shaky, okay? When you say probably, it suggests that you're not sure, okay? So you want to sound like you're definitely sure about what you're talking about, so take out qualifiers like probably, okay? And then any adjective, adverbs, these you've got to be really careful with, okay? So I know I just used one really, okay? But the key for these is typically there's a better, more elevated vocabulary word that you can say in one word instead of using a qualifier like really, okay? So it would be certainly better to just say to really, or to display the themes of, okay? But if you want to emphasize something like that, okay, you'd need to think of a word that says really display instead of just display, okay? So instead of really display, you might replace that word with emphasizes, okay? That means it does display it, but it really displays it, and it gives you one nice word to describe that sentiment, that it's not just displayed, that is very displayed. Okay, and then avoid, if you can, for the most part, using the passive voice or the construction of the passive voice that creates wordiness, okay? So we're going to look at, guys, what the passive voice is, as well as why it's typically not a great idea, but why you can use it sometimes. So there are almost always exceptions to the rules we go over, and we will look at this rule and exception today, okay? So this statement here, and the town's racist culture is made more prominent by this perspective, okay? This is an example of the passive voice here, guys. It should sound a little bit wordy and confusing, and there's certainly a way we can restructure this phrase so that it doesn't sound so, okay? So we're going to look at that in the next slide. All right, guys. So we're going to figure out here on this slide, what is the passive voice? What does that actually mean? So if you hear this from your teachers, or you get a little note in your writing that you've used the passive voice or it's a passive construction, okay, this means we've inverted the roles of the object and the subject, okay? So if a sentence is written in the active voice, this is the most typical way we write, okay? So we're going to look at an example of this, right? Where the subject is in its typical place and the subject is indeed performing the action, okay? So let's look at our example. To everyone's surprise, Alice played the piano beautifully, okay? So this is the usual construction, the active voice, okay, where your subject is performing the action. So Alice is playing the piano, okay, and typically the construction is the subject's mentioned first, then the object, okay. And just a quick reminder, you guys can always go back and look at the lecture where we went over every part of speech, and we've talked about some of these vocabulary for grammar, okay, but subject is usually the thing in the sentence doing the action, and an object is the thing in the sentence that's having something done to it, okay? So if it was a sentence where Jackie ate an apple, okay, then the passive version would be the apple was eaten by Jackie, okay? So let's look at our same example from above, but in the passive voice, okay? So in this version, the subject receives the action, okay? So to everyone's surprise, the piano was played beautifully by Alice, okay? So if we just quickly look, similar, guys, how we talked about, you're going to be deleting words or removing them typically to add strength and weight to the writing. Okay, so if you look at the example with passive voice, this is the reason you want to avoid this construction in writing, okay, is because it adds unnecessary words. The second construction doesn't say anything more, okay, and it just adds unnecessary confusion. Okay, so Alice played the piano beautifully. The piano was played beautifully by Alice. This does not have the same kind of natural flow. Okay, but as I mentioned, there are exceptions to every rule, guys, and this one is no exception, right? So you can use the passive voice at times, and it's going to sound totally normal, okay? So this is actually a useful construction. It's beneficial, right? And it says here, helpful when the subject of the sentence isn't relevant or important to the topic. Okay, so that might sound confusing, like what subject isn't relevant to the topic? It feels like it has to be relevant. Okay, but think about if you're writing a paper on the Empire State Building, okay, and you're talking about the history of the building and why it's important to New York City or America, okay. The focus of that paper would be the building itself, right? Not, say, the people who built it or the construction workers. But if you want to describe when the building was built, okay, you would use the passive construction and remove the subject, right, the construction workers or people who built the Empire State Building to talk about it. So for example, guys, this would be in the passive voice, okay, the Empire State Building was built right at this time, okay, as opposed to, so it removed the subject from that statement. So if you're going to take the subject away because it's not the focal point, this is the time you want to use the passive voice. So as opposed to saying the Empire State Building was built by construction workers, right? So we took out the subject there, right, and made the object, the Empire State Building, the focal point, okay? So the passive voice can be used, right? It's just if the subject is included or not, right? So in that version with the Empire State Building, that's actually the object when you describe when it was built. Okay. All right, guys, so if we have an idea of what weak writing looks like, okay, we had that example earlier, and we looked at some of the things that made it weak. Okay, now we're going to look at how do we fix it? How do we improve the writing so that it isn't weak, so that it comes off strong and clear? All right, so guys, let's put that statement back up and look at it one last time, right? Okay, and this is our new version, our rewritten version, where we took out some of the unnecessary language. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the components of this statement that are good, that fixed the other statement, right, that improved the weak writing. All right, so first, you should take an authoritative stance on the topic. Don't worry, guys, we're going to talk a little bit about what this is, but quite generally, you should think of it as though you're writing as if you're an expert on the topic. Even if you don't feel like one, you should appear like one in your writing. Okay, taking out unnecessary words, this might be the most important component of strong writing. It focuses on the ideas. It doesn't have a lot of fillers, unnecessary qualifiers, or vocabulary or words that don't add to your main ideas, okay? So here in this statement, so much briefer because we took out what was unnecessary and instead focused on the main point. Okay. And then, guys, don't use personal pronouns if you don't have to, okay? So similarly to the rule about the passive voice, there are times where it might be beneficial to use personal pronouns, okay? But this is when you're using I to say something like I think or I feel or I believe in your writing, okay? The reason you don't want to include this is not because you shouldn't personalize anything or think or feel certain things about, say, the literature you're reading for school or a historical movement. The key is, guys, that if you use personal pronouns, they shouldn't be to say I think, because it is implied that you think these things if you're writing them. So instead of I think the themes of racism and injustice in Harper Lee's novel are emphasized by the perspective, okay? Of course you think that if you're writing it, so you can remove that and simply say the themes of racism and injustice, okay? The other piece is I think or I believe. Qualifying it like that suggests a little lack of confidence, right? I believe this, maybe no one else does, but I kind of think it, okay? Instead, you want your writing to suggest you know it and you're telling someone that, even if it's an opinion. So I understand last week we talked about writing a thesis statement, guys, and that you need to write a statement that's not an accepted fact, not something everyone already knows. So it might sound a little counterintuitive to think, should I write as though I'm sure, because I should be writing about something that can't necessarily be proven, like suggested in my thesis statement. Okay, of course you should sound sure, because even though it is an opinion or you're developing an argument, you're going to say it as though you believe it, okay? So you're going to accept what you're saying as true, right? So not that maybe it could be seen that the themes of racism and injustice, right, are emphasized by the perspective from which the story is told, right, but that this is true. You should write as though you've already accepted that as true. All right, guys, so now we're going to look at authoritative voice. What exactly does this mean, okay? And what does it look like? Because when you say authoritative, right, it might sound like something negative, okay? So oftentimes, especially when we use it to describe like a government, authoritative doesn't necessarily mean good, but here it does. What it really just means is if you're an authority on something, you're an expert on it, okay? So if you were listening to a physician talk about how to do surgery, it's likely they would sound very confident and sure of themselves because they are an expert in that field. Okay, so you want to take the same stance with your writing. Even if you don't feel as though you are one, you should write as though, right, from the perspective that you are an expert, you know exactly what you're talking about, okay? So what isn't authoritative voice, guys? Sometimes it's really helpful to look at what things are not before we define them, okay? So it doesn't mean you sound bossy or condescending, okay? So you shouldn't sound rude, right? Authoritative voice also doesn't mean you write in caps lock a lot or they're exclamations, right? Or they're all orders, right? Instead, you just want to come off as knowledgeable on the topic, okay? You should make it sound like, and you should have done your research, okay? And that it should appear you're confident in what you're talking about. You know what you're talking about. Right, so alternatively, okay, this just means you're confident with the subject matter and your written voice shows this, okay? In other words, guys, there are stylistic choices you can make to sound like you're an authority, to sound like you're confident, to sound like you're sure of what you're talking about. So we're going to look at the stylistic components, right, that would make your writing sound authoritative, right, or confident, okay? All right, guys, so we're going to look at two examples here and compare them, right? A statement lacking authority and then one with authority, okay? All right. In Kate Chopin's novella, The Awakening, which is an example of feminist literature, the ocean can be seen as a symbol for freedom and escape. I think that the ocean is a symbol for freedom and escape because the main character in the story, Edna Pontellier, dreams of being independent, and she finally breaks out of her cage in the end by swimming out into the ocean. Okay, guys, so if you felt like there wasn't anything totally wrong with that, that's okay. Okay, but this is a statement that's lacking authority, right? So it's what we would consider weak writing. Okay, so even though the vocabulary is okay and the constructions aren't wrong, right, there are a lot of unnecessary phrases in there, and it's also set up in a way, okay, in terms of flow and order of information, okay, that isn't conducive to making your point come across well, okay? So this one's a little bit confusing. Okay, so now we'll look at a statement with authority, the same statement. We're going to point out the same things about Kate Chopin's The Awakening, okay, but this time we're going to remove the unnecessary components, and we're going to focus on the main argument. All right, guys. So here's our statement with authority, okay, making us sound indeed quite smart, okay? In Kate Chopin's feminist novella, The Awakening, the ocean serves as an important symbol for freedom and escape. The story's heroine, Edna Pontellier, finally gains her independence and breaks free from the overbearing pressure of Victorian society. Okay, guys, so we're going to look at why that first statement was weak and what the second statement does to improve it, okay? So right off the bat, the which is statement, okay, in Kate Chopin's novella, The Awakening, which is an example of, okay, this non-essential clause here doesn't add anything completely necessary to the statement, right? And it breaks up the flow right away, okay? So before the most important point is made, before you explain your main ideas, you have something breaking up the thinking and coming in and adding information, okay? So in the secondary statement, the one with authority, we've rephrased that, okay, the entire phrase, which is an example of feminist literature, okay, so we have quite a few words there. We just shifted it to feminist novella, okay, so this says the same thing, right, with just one adjective, feminist, instead of saying which is an example of feminist literature, okay, allowing us to get right to our point, right, that the ocean is a symbol for freedom and escape, okay. All right, so the next piece of the first statement that's a little bit weak, guys, is that it includes the personal pronoun, so I think that, okay. So it's clear you think it because you're writing it. You don't have to say I think that, okay. It's almost redundant to say so. And then there's also redundancy in the second sentence, okay, because in the first statement, we've already said the ocean is a symbol for freedom and escape, okay, and then we repeat it before making another point. I think that the ocean is a symbol for freedom and escape because, okay, so all of those words there were unnecessary. We've already mentioned that you think that's a symbol, okay, so you want to get into the next piece, right? So you want to start developing your argument here. And in the first example, we spent so long kind of repeating information that by the time we get to the main point, the reader might be confused and you may have lost them, okay? Oops, sorry about that, guys. Okay, and then finally, guys, even if that statement beforehand, the ocean is a symbol for freedom and escape, okay, say you hadn't mentioned that, it'd still be better to take out the I think, the personal pronoun, right? So if the first sentence were Kate Chopin's novella, The Awakening is an example of feminist literature, period, the next sentence would still be stronger if it began with the ocean. The ocean is a symbol for freedom, okay? So you don't want to include these unnecessary personal pronoun statements if you don't have to. All right, guys, which leads us to unnecessary qualifiers, right? So this is up the same alley as saying I think or sort of, okay? So qualifiers are important, guys. They can modify or change a statement, okay? If they are superlatives, they are likely important, okay? So if something is the best or the most, especially if it is measurable, the fastest mile time recorded on Earth, you want that qualifier. It's critical information that's important to the subject. So unnecessary qualifiers then, right, are something that doesn't add value to your subject, okay? So possibly, or at least could be considered by some to be one of the best indicators of weak writing, guys. Okay, so that statement should have sounded like I wasn't sure if it's a good indicator of weak writing or not, okay? So the thing is, if I sound like I'm unsure, you're reading a written work by somebody and the author, the narrator speaking, um, seems unsure of themselves, it's going to be really hard for the reader to be confident in them. In other words, if you're not confident in your own ideas, why would you expect your reader to be? Okay, so you want to make sure your writing sounds strong, okay, sounds confident, because we want to make sure the reader believes that you're confident in the ideas you're talking about, okay, because otherwise they are not going to be inclined to believe you. Okay, so our personal pronoun statements, the ones we just looked at, I think that, in my opinion, as far as I can tell, okay, as well as other unnecessary qualifiers, right, can be seen as, we use this one a lot in the examples of the weak writing, okay, just, really, okay. These statements, guys, almost never add to your writing. Similar to when we looked at really emphasizes, okay. There's almost always a better way you can construct something instead of saying really or very or obviously, okay. So instead of saying, really fast, okay, you would think of a singular vocabulary word, speedy, that can replace both of them, okay. All right, so we're going to look at two statements and compare them, okay, one with quite a few unnecessary qualifiers and then one without. The sun is obviously a symbol for renewal, and many believe that this makes the ending seem hopeful, okay. So many components of that are unnecessary. Many believe, right? We don't need to add that here. It seems like you need to qualify your opinion by saying that other people think it as well. Okay, and then seem hopeful. Here you want a more definitive statement that it is hopeful. Okay, so let's look at a version that's stronger and removes those unnecessary qualifiers. Okay, the sun symbolizes renewal, ending the story with a message of hope. So this should sound a lot stronger, and this writing should sound confident, okay? So the first statement, right, maybe they're not sure whether or not the sun, okay, is a symbol for renewal, because even though they said obviously, right, says many believe. They had to qualify it with that. Okay. The other thing is, guys, I want you to pay attention to that word obviously. While we talked about writing with authority and confidence, okay, that doesn't mean including qualifiers like obviously, okay? So remember we mentioned that authoritative voice should not sound condescending. A statement like obviously or everyone knows, that is going to sound condescending. So avoid those types of statements if possible, okay? All right, guys, so now we're going to look at word choice. So this kind of goes along with those unnecessary qualifiers, choosing a better word, say, to replace a statement like really displays, right? We could say emphasizes. So word choice is a really important component. Not only is this going to help you cut down on words, so better word choice using more specific or better descriptive words for what you're talking about will help you cut down on the amount of words that you have to use, okay? So in other words, you're writing when it's strong. Okay, it really focuses on the substance, getting to the point, as opposed to wasting space on words that aren't going to add to the writing, right? So if it doesn't move your point forward, okay, if it doesn't clarify anything, you want to remove words or vocabulary, okay, because they can detract from your writing and how impactful it is, okay, if they're just taking up space. Right? So we're going to look at this example here. Okay, and before we do, guys, I also want to talk about elevated vocabulary. So this example we're going to look at, if you're thinking, oh my God, I have no clue what that was, that's okay. The vocabulary is meant to be confusing. Okay, so I also want to mention this because I chose to write it like this because word choice can often mean simplifying your words. So sometimes students think that it's always best to use the most complex vocabulary or the fanciest word they can find. Maybe you go to the thesaurus and you put in your word and find one that sounds more academic or more formal. Okay, sometimes, guys, this can actually pull away from your writing. So when we talk about strong writing being to the point and clear, okay, sometimes this can mean brief, simple, powerful statements, okay? So never underestimate how powerful simplicity can be, okay? That you've kind of cut off the fat and you're really just looking at your main ideas. So we're going to look at this example and look at what happens when you replace a lot of your vocabulary with complex words, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the writing. Okay. In Kate Chopin's transformational novella, The Awakening, the protagonist, Edna Pontellier, an insurrectionary character vanquishing female stereotypes that were prevalent throughout the Victorian era, suggests it's necessary to escape from, instead of undertaking the endeavor of trying to change, institutionalized sexism. Okay. And just quickly, guys, there should be a comma after to change. All right, guys, so if that sounded very confusing, or we weren't sure what that was all about, okay, that's okay. It was confusing. So even though we use some complex vocabulary there, like insurrectionary, okay, it doesn't actually benefit the writing because no one has any clue what I'm talking about. So if I want to make my point very clear, right, I want to actually use some simplified vocabulary, some short, clear statements, as opposed to something very complex and wordy like this one, okay? So try not to sound, I would say, too academic, focusing too much on trying to sound smart, okay? Your ideas are what you want to focus on, and you want to write with simplicity, okay, for that reason. So we're going to look at this statement, clarified. We're going to alter it, okay? So here's our first statement, okay, with the elevated vocabulary, but very confusing, okay? And now we're going to edit it down to focus on the main ideas, right? So instead of this version, okay, look how brief this statement is, guys. The key to this is, right, if we're going to figure out what did that actually say, this is all it said. Okay, so if we were able to say this, right, that long, confusing statement so simplistically, you absolutely should. Okay, so let's reread the statement. Similar sentiments. We haven't really taken away any information, so that first long, confusing statement doesn't add value. It's not clear. It doesn't make a better or more complex point. Okay, so our new statement, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, reveals the harmful consequences of sexism during the Victorian era. Okay, all the same sentiments, and this time my point is clear. You know what the paper will be on. You understand what it's about, and it focuses on, right, your argument, what that novel does in terms of revealing some kind of cultural consequences. Okay, so the key is, guys, strong writing doesn't unnecessarily utilize, I would say, overly complex vocabulary. It's okay to use a thesaurus if you're trying to think a word and you can't quite get your finger on it, but try not to overly utilize this resource. You don't want to just put in a word to the thesaurus, click and see what happens, and certainly do not select a thesaurus word that you don't know the definition of, okay? Absolutely look it up, because just because two words are synonyms don't mean that they are contextually interchangeable, that you can kind of just swap them in and out, okay? All right, guys, so we are going to now review some of these main concepts. We're going to talk about what did we go over that showed strong writing, okay, that showed authoritative, confident writing versus weak writing. And I want you to think about this process, this cycle, when you're developing your own papers, okay, when you're writing and when you're editing, okay, especially when you're editing. So when you read a statement, when you're going through and making revisions on something you've already read, okay, focus on asking about the value of the statement. So you should read a sentence or paragraph and say, does that serve my main point? Does it clarify a component of my argument? Does it make clear what my conclusions are or build on my thinking or logic? Because if it doesn't, you should delete it, okay? All right, so what is strong writing? So we're going to go with the 3 C's. It's confident, okay? So you should be speaking with conviction and authority, okay? So as though you are an expert on the subject you are writing on, okay? It's clear, okay? So no time is wasted rambling, okay? It gets straight to the point, and it makes your argument the focal point of the writing, okay? Or at least your topic, right? And then it is also concise, okay? So good writing removes unnecessary details that take away from the main point of the writing. All right, guys, so this is the cycle for strong writing. We're also going to look at what constitutes a quick review of weak writing, right? The things that we don't want to do. Okay. All right, so it's confusing, right? So it's rambling, it's not focused, and don't forget overly complex. So too much elevated vocabulary, too wordy. This can actually pull away from the writing, right? So sometimes simple is better. Cliched, right? So I kind of skipped over this, but if we look back at the example from The Awakening, there was a cliched statement in there. At the end, it said she breaks free from her cage, okay, in the faux introduction we wrote. Okay, you don't want to use statements like that, breaks free from the cage, or statements that are used over and over again, right? The reason is it makes your writing seem a little bit boring, or maybe seem like it's lacking unique ideas. In other words, if you have to use a cliched statement that's been used over and over again, it indicates you didn't have a way of phrasing it on your own, okay? And if you do, I promise. So I promise you can find a way to rephrase the sentiment of a cliche without actually using a cliche. So this detracts from your writing, okay? But I just want to make clear, a cliched statement is not the same as a famous quotation, okay? So while to be or not to be is likely considered a cliche, it's also a quotation. So if you're, say, writing a paper on Shakespeare's Hamlet, okay, and you want to talk about the to be or not to be soliloquy, of course you can quote it even though someone considered this cliched because you're discussing that literature, okay? But these are statements that you're going to use on your own, not as direct quotes. Okay, and then casual, guys. We didn't talk too much about this today because I wanted the writing to seem somewhat strong when you read it and understand what about it made it weak. Okay, but you should not have casual statements, especially in academic writing. In other words, you want to match the value and quality of your ideas with the writing, okay, not to be confused with selecting overly complex words from a thesaurus, okay, but you do not want to use casual phrases, right, this stuff, or, you know, neat, or you could see it as, right? You want to make sure that your writing is elevated in a way, okay, that it could be turned in for academics. In other words, guys, if you have time to think about and consider what you're writing, if you have, say, a couple days or a couple weeks to write something, an essay for school, it should be revised and edited and changed, okay, as opposed to something written quickly. So the more time you have to complete something, the less casual language it can include, it should include. So if you're writing something briefly, right, in a timed period, write something, express your thoughts in 10 minutes. It's okay to have some casual language. If you're writing an essay for your English class and you've had 2 weeks to construct it, you should take the time to remove or delete any kind of casual phrases that take away from your ideas. Okay. So guys, the main takeaway here today should be that strong writing is confident, okay, clear, and it's easy to understand. It focuses or elevates the ideas, okay, and eliminates unnecessary language and qualifiers, okay? So the name of the game when you're writing and when you're editing your own writing, when you're parceling it down afterwards, is ask yourself, okay, is this strong? So is it clear? Is it concise? Do I sound like an expert? Okay, and then to notice weak writing, is it confusing? Is it overly complex or hard to understand? Okay, does it use too many unnecessary qualifiers and ramble? Okay, so on the other end of the spectrum, guys, does this writing add to my main point? And if it's weak, we should remove it. We should delete the statement, okay? So good writing does not mean long writing, right? You want to say as much as you can in as few words as possible. All right, guys, so if you enjoyed our lecture today, we're actually going to take a 2-week break this time, and we're going to reconvene on May 20th, okay, to revisit some more core grammar rules and also look at how to apply it to your own writing. And as always, guys, if you're looking for private lessons or one-on-one teaching and tutoring, especially during this time when it's so tricky, there's a loss in your typical academic experience right now because you're not in the classroom like you always were. If you need a little bit of extra support, go ahead and reach out to us on any of these mediums. Feel free to call, go to our website. Otherwise, we will see you in 2 weeks for segment 8 of grammar rules that you must know, right? It was so great seeing you guys this week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.